The silver fuselage of the B-29 Superfortress cut through the Pacific sky with the imposing presence of a flying cathedral. It was March 1945, and Boeing B-29 City of Los Angeles, serial number 42 to 24625, hummed at 30,000 feet over the endless ocean, returning from yet another incendiary mission over Tokyo. The afternoon sun reflected off the metallic wings, creating flashes that could be seen for miles. Inside the aircraft, the air smelled of hot oil, sweat, and reheated coffee. Captain Howard Jarrell, a 26-year-old pilot with an angular face and blue eyes that never blinked during flight, kept his hands steady on the yoke. Beside him, co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Chen checked the instruments for the 10th time that hour. Behind them, in the pressurized cabin, 9 other men performed their duties with the precision of a Swiss watch: navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 5 gunners scattered throughout the defensive turrets. The B-29 was the most advanced weapon of World War II. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines roared with 2,200 horsepower each. Cabin pressurization. Analog bombing computer. Capacity to carry 4 tons of incendiary bombs over 1,500 miles. It was technology that made the Germans look backward and the Japanese desperate. But technology doesn't mean invincibility. The mission had been hell. More than 300 B-29s had dumped thousands of tons of M69 incendiary bombs over Tokyo's wooden neighborhoods. The sky had turned red with the reflection of flames devouring the Japanese capital. Smoke rose in black columns so dense that some bombers had to climb 10,000 feet just to keep from choking their engines. The smell of burning flesh rose into the stratosphere. But the Japanese didn't die quietly. Type 88 75mm anti-aircraft artillery transformed the sky into a deadly constellation of black bursts. Kawasaki Ki 61, Tony, and Nakajima Ki 84 Frank fighters climbed to intercept, their kamikaze pilots willing to do anything. 2 B-29s from the formation exploded in orange fireballs. 3 others disappeared into the clouds, smoking, never seen again. The city of Los Angeles had survived, but not unscathed. A 75mm shell had exploded just 20 meters from the tail, launching superheated steel fragments in all directions. Shrapnel perforated the fuselage like paper. The tail gunner, Sergeant Michael O'Brien, had been hit in the shoulder, a deep cut that stained his leather jacket with dark blood. He groaned over the intercom but remained at his post, eyes scanning the sky behind them. Formation Delta, 3 to all aircraft. Maintain altitude and course. Iwo Jima in 1 hour, crackled the metallic voice of the mission commander over the radio. Jarrell adjusted the trim and looked at the instrument panel. Oil pressure, normal. Cylinder temperature, high, but acceptable. Fuel, sufficient to reach Iwo Jima, the recently captured island that now served as an emergency base. But something was wrong. The yoke was heavy. Not much. Just enough to be noticed. As if someone were pulling lightly in the opposite direction. "Chen, you feeling this?" Jarrell asked, moving the yoke left then right. The co-pilot frowned and tested his own controls. "Yes, sir." Increased resistance. Probably damage to the control cables. Or compromised hydraulics. "Engineer, check the hydraulic systems," Jarrell ordered over the intercom. Technical Sergeant Bill Hayes, a man with thick hands and a face marked by 1,000 flight hours, descended from the upper turret and began checking the hydraulic panels behind the pilots. His eyes widened. "Captain, we've got fluid loss in the primary system. Pressure dropping. I'm trying to isolate it, but—" A metallic snap echoed through the fuselage. And then the yoke went limp in Jarrell's hand. Completely limp. As if it had been disconnected from everything. "Control lost," Chen shouted, grabbing his own yoke that now spun freely with no resistance whatsoever. The B-29 began to bank right. Slowly at first. then faster. The horizon rotated through the cockpit window. The blue ocean was getting closer. Jarrell pulled the yoke hard. Nothing. Pushed. Nothing. The rudder pedals responded weakly, but the elevators and ailerons were dead. 30,000 feet above the Pacific, with 1,000 miles between them and safety, the city of Los Angeles had just become a 130,000-pound glider falling toward the ocean. And Captain Howard Jarrell had maybe 90 seconds to figure out how to fly an aircraft without controls. The altimeter spun backward like a crazed clock. 28,000 feet. 27,500. 27,000. With each second, the B-29 lost altitude while banking inexorably to the right, the wing almost touching vertical. Through the cockpit window, Jarrell saw the Pacific Ocean spinning in a navy blue whirlpool that would soon swallow them. "Everyone on intercom now!" Jarrell roared, keeping his voice steady despite the terror hammering in his chest. "Hayes, I want a report in 10 seconds or I'm ordering everyone to bail." The flight engineer was already on his knees, ripping access panels from the command cabin. His trained hands moved with brutal speed, checking hydraulic connections, steel cables, and servo mechanisms. Red hydraulic fluid dripped from the ceiling like blood. "Captain, primary hydraulic system completely drained." Hayes shouted over the roar of the engines. "Shrapnel must have cut the main line. Auxiliary system also compromised. Wait. Wait." He followed a steel cable with his fingers, tracing it through the internal structure of the fuselage. The cable was taut, but when he pulled, he felt irregular resistance. Like a frayed rope about to snap. "The elevator control cables are compromised, sir. Still connected, but... Christ, they're hanging by just a few strands. Any sudden movement and they'll rupture completely." Jarrell processed the information in milliseconds. The elevators controlled nose up and down. Without them, there was no recovering from the dive. But if the cables were still partially connected... "Chen!" he shouted. "Hands on the yoke with me. Now!" The co-pilot grabbed his yoke. Together, with microscopic movements, they began pulling back. Very gently. As if they were trying not to wake a sleeping tiger. The nose of the B-29 responded. Just a few degrees. But it responded. 23,000 feet. The lateral bank, however, worsened. The right wing pointed toward the ocean like an arrow. Without functioning ailerons, there was no roll control. Jarrell stomped on the left rudder pedal with all the force his legs allowed. The B-29 shuddered. The rudder, the vertical surface on the tail, still had some authority. The aircraft began to slide laterally through the air, the nose pointing left while the right wing still fell. It was ugly. It was inefficient. But it was working. "Crew, this is the pilot," Jarrell spoke into the intercom, forcing calm into each word. "We've lost primary control. I'm flying on rudder and engine power alone. O'Brien, you still conscious back there?" The tail gunner's voice came weak but firm. "Still here, Captain. Bleeding like a stuck pig, but still here." "Good man. Everyone, prepare to abandon if I give the order." "But not yet. Not yet." Jarrell looked at Chen. The co-pilot's eyes were wide, but his hands remained steady on the yoke. "We're going to try something," Jarrell said. "The engines. We can use asymmetric power to control roll." Chen understood immediately. The four Wright R-3350 engines weren't just propulsion sources. They were four independent sources of thrust that could be modulated individually. Jarrell pushed the throttles for engines 3 and 4, the engines on the right side, forward. Increased power. Simultaneously, he slightly reduced engines 1 and 2 on the left. The effect was immediate. With more thrust on the right, the aircraft began to rotate against the bank. The right wing rose a few degrees. Not much. But enough. 20,000 feet. It's working, Chen exclaimed, voice laden with incredulous hope. Don't celebrate yet, Jarrell responded through clenched teeth. His hands were welded to the throttles, making constant micro-adjustments. It was like balancing a bowling ball on a needle while running on a treadmill. Each power adjustment needed to be compensated with rudder pedals. Too much thrust on the right and the nose spun uncontrollably. Too little and the wing fell again. And through all of it, he and Chen needed to maintain almost imperceptible pressure on the yoke to keep the nose from dropping, but not so much that it would rupture the already damaged control cables. It was flying by pure instinct, by feel, by the silent language between pilot and machine that no manual would ever teach. 16,000 feet. The navigator, Lieutenant James Wu, appeared in the command cabin with his navigation chart. Captain, we're still 140 miles from Iwo Jima. Favorable wind, but with this rate of descent. I know, Jarrell cut him off. We're going to arrive very low. Or not arrive at all. Wu swallowed hard and returned to his station. The radio operator, Corporal Marcus Johnson, his voice steady despite obvious fear, transmitted on the emergency channel. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. City of Los Angeles, Superfortress 42 to 24,625, flight controls compromised, 120 miles northwest of Iwo Jima, uncontrolled descent, 11 souls on board. The response crackled immediately. City of Los Angeles, this is Iwo Jima Control Tower. We confirm your emergency. Field prepared for emergency landing. Ambulances and fire trucks on standby. Keep this frequency open. Copied, Iwo, Johnson responded. But everyone in the cabin knew the truth. Iwo Jima had 2 runways, yes. But landing a B-29 without proper controls on a tiny island in the middle of the ocean was practically impossible. 12,000 feet. Jarrell looked out the window. The ocean was no longer a blue abstraction. He could see individual waves. White foam. The texture of the water. Hayes, he called. Is there any way to restore controls? Bypass. Anything. The flight engineer was covered in hydraulic fluid, sweat, and desperation. No, sir. Not without landing and making structural repairs. The cables are... They're coming apart as we speak. I can see the strands breaking one by one. Estimated time until complete rupture? Hayes looked at the vibrating cables, listened to the high-pitched metallic groan of the stressed fuselage. Impossible to say. 5 minutes. 50 minutes. Or in the next second. Jarrell nodded. There was nothing left to do but continue. 8,000 feet. And then engine number 3 began to cough. One cylinder failed. Then another. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. Oil temperature spiked into the red zone. The engine had been pushed beyond its limits, and now it was dying. Fire in engine 3. Chen shouted, pointing to the yellow flames licking the cowling. Jarrell pulled the engine 3 throttle to cut off. Activated the fire extinguisher. White foam plumes exploded around the engine, smothering the flames. But now they had a bigger problem. With engine 3 dead, the asymmetric thrust that kept the aircraft level disappeared. The right wing fell again, faster than before. Compensate! Jarrell roared, pushing engine 4 to emergency power, 2,500 revolutions per minute, far beyond recommended, while stomping on the left pedal with enough force to break bones. The B-29 yawed violently. The nose pointed at the sky for a terrifying moment, then fell back. Instruments swayed on their panels. Men were thrown against bulkheads. 4,000 feet. Iwo Jima visible. Wu shouted from the navigation station. Through the front window, Jarrell saw it. A brownish-gray smudge on the blue horizon. The island. Volcanic. small, and very, very far away. They were too low, descending too fast, and now flying on 3 engines in an aircraft that barely responded to commands. Jarrell looked at Chen. The co-pilot looked back. Neither needed to speak. They weren't going to make it. 2,500 feet. The Pacific Ocean stretched below them like a liquid gray-blue plain, dotted with white crests that looked like teeth waiting to chew metal and flesh. Iwo Jima lay ahead, a dark, jagged island emerging like a scar on the skin of the sea, but still terribly distant. The B-29 continued descending, and now Jarrell could feel the aircraft trembling under his hands, like a wounded animal struggling to stay alive. "Captain, at current rate of descent, we'll hit the water 7 miles from shore," Wu declared from navigation, clinical voice masking terror. "We're not going to make it." "Then we change the rate," Jarrell growled. He pulled the yoke back, gently, millimeter by millimeter, feeling through his palms the phantom tension in the nearly severed cables. Chen mirrored each movement. Together, like a single organism, they convinced the superfortress's nose to rise 2 degrees. The rate of descent decreased. 600 feet per minute. 500. 400. But the cost was brutal. Speed bled away. 180 knots. 170. 165. Dangerously close to stall speed, the point where the wings could no longer generate lift and the aircraft would fall from the sky like a 130,000-pound stone. "Critical speed, sir," Chen warned, eyes glued to the airspeed indicator. I know," Jarrell responded, jaw locked. "Hayes, give me everything the engines have." "Everything." The flight engineer pushed the 3 remaining engines to maximum emergency power. The right R-3350s screamed in protest, cylinders firing at temperatures that would make metal melt. The tachometer for Engine 4 passed 2,600 revolutions per minute. The manual said this would destroy the engine in 15 minutes. They didn't have 15 minutes. 2,000 feet. Iwo Jima grew. Jarrell could see details now. Mount Suribachi to the south, a volcanic mountain where American Marines had planted the flag just weeks ago in a photograph that would define the war. The 2 parallel runways cutting across the island. Bomb craters. Military vehicles scattered like toys. And boats around the coast. American destroyers. Patrol ships. "Johnson, transmit our exact position," Jarrell ordered. "If we can't make the runway, maybe we can ditch close enough to a ship for rescue." "Yes, sir," the radio operator responded, voice breaking only on the last syllable. 1,300 feet. The right wing shuddered, then dropped 15 degrees in 1 second. "Wing stall," Chan shouted. Jarrell stomped on the rudder pedal so hard he felt something pop in his knee. Pushed Engine 4 even further. 2,650 revolutions per minute, the engine was literally self-destructing, and let the nose drop slightly to recover speed. The wing leveled. Barely. 1,000 feet. They were over water now, so low they could see seagulls scattering in panic. Ocean spray hit the underside of the fuselage. For the first time in his life, Jarrell could smell the sea at 30,000 feet altitude. Salty, wet, freezing. "Coastline ahead," Wu shouted. The southern edge of Iwo Jima approached. Black beaches of volcanic sand. Then solid ground. Then the runway. But they were still too low. "Crew, crash positions," Jarrell ordered. "Chen, on my command, cut all engines. We're going to glide to the runway or die trying." "Understood, sir." 650 feet. The coastline passed beneath them with a roar. Solid ground. Jarrell saw soldiers running, pointing at the sky. Vehicles stopping. The giant shadow of the B-29 swept across the ground like the wing of death. 500 feet. The runway was ahead. Runway 24, freshly constructed by the Seabees in rough concrete. 6,000 feet long. Sufficient, maybe. But there was a problem. A huge problem. They were coming in too fast. And too high. And the angle was completely wrong. A normal B-29 landing required a gentle 3-degree approach, touching the runway at 120 knots with full control of elevators, ailerons, flaps, and brakes. Jarrell had 170 knots of speed, a 6-degree angle, no real control, and was coming in like a meteor. Chan, flaps. Flaps not responding, sir. Hydraulic system dead. Damn it. Okay. No flaps. We're landing hot. 330 feet. The beginning of the runway filled the cockpit window. Jarrell pulled the yoke back. Felt the control cables scream. Heard a metallic snap inside the fuselage, one of the strands breaking. The nose rose. Just a little. Enough. Cut the engines. Now. Chen pulled all 3 throttles to cut off. The engines died with a descending groan. Sudden silence. Only the whistle of wind over the fuselage. The B-29 glided. 3 eternal seconds. A cathedral of metal floating in the air by pure inertia. Then gravity won. The main landing gear hit the concrete at 165 knots with a violence that made Jarrell's teeth clash. The entire fuselage convulsed. Rivets popped. Panels vibrated. The right landing gear disintegrated, the wheel exploding into pieces of black rubber. The B-29 tilted right. The wing touched the runway in an explosion of orange sparks. Metal tore concrete. The propeller of engine 4 shattered, blades flying like guillotines. "Hold on! Hold on!" Jarrell shouted, fighting with the rudder that was now just a useless piece of metal. The aircraft spun. 90 degrees to the right. Sliding sideways down the runway at 100 knots. 80. 60. The right wing struck a parked fuel truck. The tank exploded in a fireball that enveloped the rear half of the superfortress. Orange and black flames rose 100 feet into the air. 40 knots. 30. And then, finally, 2,600 feet down the runway, with the right wing torn off, the landing gear destroyed, the tail smoking and half the fuselage in flames, the B-29 city of Los Angeles stopped. Absolute silence for 2 seconds. Then, out. Everyone out. Jarrell shouted, ripping off his seatbelt. Hatches were kicked open. Men jumped. Chan helped Hayes out of the command cabin. Wu and Johnson descended through the front hatch. The gunners emerged from the turrets, coughing black smoke. O'Brien, the wounded tail gunner, was last. 2 crewmen dragged him out as flames consumed the rear section. Jarrell jumped from the front hatch and ran. 20 meters. 30. 50. Behind him, fuel tank number 3 exploded. The shock wave threw him to the ground. Heat washed over his back like a dragon's breath. He rolled onto his back, gasping, and looked behind. The city of Los Angeles was dying. Flames engulfed the fuselage. The tail collapsed. The left wing began to melt. Secondary explosions detonated residual ammunition. Tracers flew in all directions like crazed fireworks. But 11 men were alive. All 11. On the ground of Iwo Jima. Burned, bruised, traumatized. But alive. Fire trucks arrived, spraying foam over the wreckage. Ambulances screeched to stops. Medics ran with stretchers. Jarrell sat on the volcanic sand ground, knees bent, hands shaking uncontrollably as adrenaline finally abandoned him. Chen sat beside him. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, the co-pilot whispered, "How the hell did we do that?" Jarrell looked at his hands. Still shaking. Covered in soot and blood from injuries he didn't even know he had. "I don't know," he answered honestly. I think the aircraft didn't know it was impossible. The smoke rose in a black column that could be seen from any point on the island. The city of Los Angeles, that technological marvel of aluminum and steel that had cost $600,000 in 1943, that had survived 17 missions over Japan, that had carried death to Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya, was now just a twisted smoking carcass on the side of runway 24. Firefighters finally controlled the flames an hour after landing. What remained looked like a dead whale beached, exposed metal skeleton, melted aluminum skin, mechanical innards scattered in a 50-meter radius. The right wing had been completely torn off. The tail hung at an unnatural angle, supported only by a few twisted structural members. Of the 4 right R-3350 engines, 3 were total ruins. The 4th, Engine 1, the only one not pushed beyond its limits, might be salvaged. Maybe. Howard Jarrell stood staring at the wreckage until the sun set. He refused medical treatment beyond basic bandages for the cuts on his hands. He simply stood there, uniform torn, face black with soot, eyes distant. An Air Force chaplain approached. Young, maybe 24 years old, with round glasses and a silver crucifix hanging from his neck. "Captain Jarrell? I'm Chaplain Morrison. Just came to see how you're doing." Jarrell didn't look away from the wreckage. 11 men, he said, voice hoarse from shouting. 11. We should have died 7 times today. But we didn't. God was with you. Jarrell finally looked at the chaplain. His blue eyes were red but dry. God, he repeated bitterly. God was with us when we dropped napalm on residential neighborhoods in Tokyo? When we burned alive 100,000 civilians? Women, children, old people who couldn't run. Morrison fell silent. There was no easy answer. There never was. Jarrell rubbed his face with both hands. Sorry, Chaplain. That wasn't meant for you. It's just, this aircraft should have been our coffin. And it wasn't. And I don't know how to process that. Maybe, Morrison said gently, it's not for processing. Maybe it's just for accepting. You had skill, luck, and this incredible machine that fought for you until the last second. Sometimes that's enough. Jarrell looked again at the wreckage. The cockpit was surprisingly intact. The front window glass cracked but not shattered. The pilot seats, where he and Chen had spent 6 hours fighting the impossible, were still bolted to their rails. The yoke, that piece of metal that had become an extension of his hands, hung at a strange angle. He wondered if the control cables had finally ruptured, if they'd shattered at the moment of impact, or if they were still there, hanging by those last stubborn strands. He would never check. Didn't want to know. 3 days later, in an improvised briefing room at Iwo Jima Air Base, Jarrell and his crew faced a formal investigation. The room smelled of watered-down military coffee and mimeographed paper. A colonel in his 50s with a face like granite and enough ribbons on his chest to weigh 10 pounds presided. "Captain Jarrell," the colonel began, voice of someone who'd judged 1,000 men before, "why didn't you order the crew to abandon the aircraft when you lost controls?" Jarrell sat upright, uniform clean now, but with hands still bandaged. "Because, sir, we still had the possibility of controlling it. And because 11 parachutes over the Pacific with search and rescue hours away would probably mean 11 dead instead of 11 alive." "Did you have training to fly an aircraft without primary control surfaces?" "No, sir. Nobody does. Because it's considered impossible. And yet you did it." "Yes, sir." With Lieutenant Chen, Sergeant Hayes, and an aircraft that simply refused to die. The colonel made a notation. Turned a page. The engineering report from the wreckage indicates that the elevator control cables were held by only 18% of their original thickness at the moment of landing. 8 of the 12 steel strands had ruptured completely. The remaining 4 were seconds from catastrophic failure. Silence in the room. You flew a 130,000-pound aircraft for 120 miles over open ocean and landed. Landing is a generous word. The report says controlled impact, with control cables that were 82% destroyed. Yes, sir. That, the colonel said, looking directly at Jarrell, is probably the most extraordinary piloting I've witnessed in 28 years of service. You and your crew are being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The aircraft will be dismantled for parts. You'll have 2 weeks' leave before returning to active duty. He stood. Everyone in the room did the same. Questions, Captain? Jarrell hesitated. Sir, how many B-29s did we lose on the Tokyo mission? The colonel consulted a folder. 14 aircraft. 154 crewmen killed or missing. Jarrell closed his eyes. And how many Japanese civilians? The colonel closed the folder. Above my classification level, Captain. Dismissed. Michael O'Brien, the tail gunner, survived the shoulder wound. Lost 40% mobility in his right arm and was sent home on medical discharge in June 1945. He opened a hardware store in Nebraska and never boarded an airplane again. Robert Chen continued flying. Became a command pilot, survived the war, then flew C-54s in the Berlin airlift. Died in 1987 in Los Angeles, at 68, of natural causes. His obituary didn't mention Iwo Jima. Bill Hayes, the engineer who fought with the fuselage bleeding hydraulic fluid, became a flight engineering instructor. Trained 2,000 crew members in the following decades. In a 1982 interview, he said, "I still dream about those cables. I still hear the sound of them breaking. Every night for 37 years. Howard Jarrell completed 12 more missions before the war ended. Was decorated with the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 4 oak leaf clusters, and the Purple Heart for minor injuries. After the war, he declined offers from commercial aviation. Became a math teacher at a high school in Oregon. He never spoke publicly about Iwo Jima. But in 1963, when a 16-year-old student asked if he had stories from the war, Jarrell was silent for a long time. Then said only, "Once I flew an aircraft that shouldn't have been able to fly, and landed where it shouldn't have been able to land, with men who shouldn't have been alive. And it taught me that sometimes the impossible is just the difficult we haven't accepted yet." The wreckage of B-29 City of Los Angeles was dragged to a scrap depot on Iwo Jima. Some parts, instruments, engine sections, structural components, were sent back to the United States for material failure analysis. The rest was cut for scrap and melted down. No memorial was built. No plaque. It was just another aircraft in a war that consumed tens of thousands. But on summer nights in Oregon, when commercial airliners passed high overhead leaving white trails in the twilight sky, Howard Jarrell sometimes stopped what he was doing, looked up, and remembered. He remembered Chen's hands mirroring his on the yokes. He remembered Hayes on his knees in hydraulic fluid. He remembered the roar of engines being destroyed to keep 11 souls in the air. He remembered the Iwo Jima runway appearing through the cracked windshield like an impossible promise. And he remembered a simple truth that war taught him and that he could never unlearn. That the line between flying and falling, between living and dying, between the possible and the impossible, is sometimes as thin as 8 steel strands. And that sometimes, just sometimes, with skill, luck, courage, and a machine that refuses to give up, you can balance on that line and come home. Even when every law of physics says you shouldn't.